According to Section 35 of the Constitution, Aboriginal people have the right to protect their cultural practices, but the practice must be custom or tradition integral to the distinctive culture of the Aboriginal group prior to European contact. In this case, Dorothy Vanderpeet, a member of the Stolos Nation, was charged with selling salmon under a food fishing license, which only allowed Aboriginal people to fish for subsistence, not for commercial sale. She argued in BC Supreme Court, the BC Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court of Canada. However, the government believed that her actions are not protected by the Constitution. Vanderpeet's appeal failed. Although the decisions of the courts are harsh towards her, her case provided important information about the Aboriginal rights, and the Vanderpeet trilogy was invented, which provides assistance towards further Aboriginal court cases.
The case wasn't just about selling fish. It was about the deeper question: what counts as an Aboriginal right in Canadian law? Dorothy Vanderpeet's defense argued that the Stolo people had a long-standing tradition of fishing and trading salmon, a practice that was integral to their culture and economy long before European contact. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. At the center of the case was this legal question: does Dorothy Vanderpeet's rights to sell fish fall under the protection of Section 35 of the Constitution Act? Section 35 reads, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." But what exactly is an existing Aboriginal right? The court needed to define and interpret this phrase for the first time in Canadian history. In 1996, the Supreme Court found that while fishing was an Aboriginal right, selling fish was not a practice integral to the Stolo culture prior to European contact. Chief Justice Lamer, writing for the majority, introduced a legal framework that would later be known as the integral to a distinctive culture test. The test requires courts to ask: is the activity in question a practice, custom, or tradition integral to the distinctive culture of the Aboriginal group? Was it a central, defining feature of that culture before European contact? This means the practice must have been so essential that the culture would be fundamentally altered without it. In Vanderpeet's case, the court decided that while the Stolo fished for food and sometimes exchanged fish, systematic commercial selling was not proven to be integral to their culture at the time of contact. As a result, the right to sell fish was not protected under Section 35. Section 35 was a monumental inclusion in the Canadian Constitution because it formally acknowledged indigenous rights as part of the highest law in the land. However, Vanderpeet showed how courts could narrow the interpretation of those rights. Many indigenous leaders and scholars criticized the ruling, arguing it placed colonial standards of evidence and tradition above indigenous knowledge. To understand why Aboriginal right exists in Canadian law at all, we must go back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Issued by King George III. This document was one of the first formal recognitions of indigenous land rights. It stated that indigenous land could not be taken or sold without formal treaties. It laid the groundwork for the principle of indigenous sovereignty and helped shape the legal tradition that eventually led to Section 35. While Vanderpeet wasn't about land directly, the underlying principle is the same. The Crown has an obligation to recognize and respect indigenous legal traditions and practices. But in this case, the Supreme Court placed limits on that recognition. And many argue those limits reflect a colonial mindset that continues to affect indigenous peoples today. So while R versus Vander Peet may have appeared to be a small case about selling 10 salmon, it became one of the most influential rulings in Canadian Indigenous law. It set the legal tone of how courts would interpret Aboriginal rights going forward, with a narrow pre-contact lens. And though the ruling was disappointing to many Indigenous communities, it sparked ongoing legal and political advocacy that continues to shape the story of Indigenous rights in Canada today. So, Felicitas, as the expert of this case, could you please tell us why is the R versus Vander Peet decision still controversial today? What are the political and societal changes?
The Vander Peet trilogy also had a strong impact on political discourse and social changes in Canada. Politically, it sparked major debate about how Indigenous rights should be recognized and respected within Canadian law. Many Indigenous leaders and communities criticized the ruling, arguing that they reinforced colonial ideas by forcing Indigenous peoples to prove their rights based on a pre-contact standard. This led to increased calls for legal reform and recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. In response, the trilogy became a turning point in political discussions about reconciliation. It pushed more Indigenous voices into the national conversation, demanding change, not just in the courts, but in government policies and relationships between Indigenous nations. It helped build momentum for broader movements like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the push for implementing the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, the UNDRIP. Societally, the ruling raised awareness among Canadians about the struggles Indigenous communities face in having their rights recognized. It encouraged greater public discussion about colonialism, justice, and the need to support Indigenous-led solutions, while the decision was limiting. It also motivated communities and allies to push for a more respectful and inclusive future in Canada.
Thank you for the explanation. Based on this, how did Indigenous communities react to the decision?
The Vander Peet trilogy of 1996 had a major cultural and societal impact on Indigenous communities in Canada. These Supreme Court cases defined Aboriginal rights as practices that had to be part of an Indigenous culture before European contact. This made it very difficult for Indigenous people to have their rights recognized, especially since colonization had already disrupted many traditional practices. Indigenous communities reacted with concern and frustration. They felt the ruling forced them to freeze their cultures in the past, ignoring how traditions naturally changed and adapt over time. Many culture activities have been restricted or banned by the government, so proving they exist in the same form before colonization was unfair and unrealistic. The decision also affected communities socially and economically. It made it harder for Indigenous people to claim rights to hunt, fish, or trade in ways that supported their families and upheld their cultural values. As a result, many saw the ruling as limiting their ability to live according to their own traditions and to thrive economically. In short, the Vanderpeet trilogy created a legal standard that didn't reflect the realities of indigenous life. It made asserting rights harder and failed to support the ongoing survival and growth of indigenous cultures in today's society.
In conclusion, the R.V. Vanderpeet decision continues to shape indigenous rights in Canada. Nearly 30 years after it was decided, while the Supreme Court's ruling set a clear legal framework for recognizing Aboriginal rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. 1982, though what became known as the Vanderpeet test, the case also highlighted deep tensions in Canadian law and society. The test focused on pre-contacted practices forced Indigenous communities to prove their rights based on a frozen moment in history, ignoring the realities of cultural change and adaptation. Many Indigenous people and scholars have criticized this approach as reinforcing colonial perspectives that limit Indigenous sovereignty and ignore the harm caused by the centuries of disruption. Despite these changes, the case also sparked important discussions about reconciliation, sovereignty, and the future of Indigenous rights in Canada. It became a catalyst for political advocacy, societal awareness, and later legal developments, such as Delgamu, Marshall, and Tuquetin, that have begun to shift away from the strict limits set by Vanderpeet. The decision remains a reminder for both the progress and the work still needed to ensure Indigenous rights are recognized and respected in Canada's legal system.